Hey guys, welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. It's Samuel Allred on the mic, and today we're going to go over some hunting terminology. And this time, the theme is terms you'll hear at the shooting range. Shooting is a skill, so it takes some practice. And as easy as it may appear, making consistent, accurate shots at distance can be surprisingly challenging. This is especially true when you're in field conditions, shooting at odd angles and under stress. If you want to hear a story about me making a poor shot and actually a whole series of poor decisions under stress, go listen to episode 11, Big Blunders and Busts of 2024. Also, if you're new to hunting, it's not just the trigger pull and stabilizing the rifle you have to worry about. You also need to build familiarity with your entire shooting system. You need to know how to adjust the safety, how to load and unload the gun, how to operate the bolt, lever action, or charging handle, how to adjust your scope, all of that. While it may seem early, getting out to the range this month will give you enough time to practice and actually improve before the hunting season begins. Becoming proficient with your weapon means more than sighting it in on a bench and going hunting the next day. You actually have to have some time in between your practice sessions so you can diagnose problems and work out kinks so that you're more confident when you hit the field. So do yourself and the animals a favor and plan some time to practice well before the season starts. As always, before we jump in, I'm going to ask you for a favor. Please take a moment to hit the follow button on whatever platform you listen on, whether that's Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and share an episode with a friend. This will help the podcast grow and help more people get outside and into hunting. So thank you so much for your support, and let's dive in. So the first term I want to talk about is caliber. Caliber is often used interchangeably with the term cartridge, but it's different. The caliber of a gun actually refers to the internal diameter of the barrel. Now, we'll sometimes also use caliber to refer to the diameter of the projectile. And that might be even more common, even though the technical definition is the internal diameter of the barrel. Caliber can be measured in inches or millimeters. And when it's measured in inches, usually it's measured using a decimal because the size of the projectiles or the internal diameter of the barrel of the gun is so small. So you may have a 0.3 caliber bullet, okay? And often when people are referring to a decimal caliber using inches, they just forget the decimal and call it something like 30. So you might have a 0.30 caliber projectile, but people just refer to it as 30 caliber. Or you might have a 0.270 caliber projectile, but people just refer to it as 270. So that's important to understand. Now, if someone said, I'm shooting a 30 caliber gun, it could be shooting all sorts of different cartridges. It could be shooting a .308 Winchester cartridge. It could be shooting a .30-06 Springfield cartridge. It could be shooting a .300 Winchester Magnum cartridge, and others, because they all have the same caliber of bullet. When measured in millimeters, it's a little bit easier because a 7 millimeter bullet is going to be 7 millimeters in diameter, or it's going to fit a gun that has a barrel with an internal diameter of 7 millimeters. So you get the picture. Just remember that it's different than cartridge. So cartridge, on the other hand, is the whole package that you put into your gun to fire. So it includes the bullet, it includes the case, it includes the powder, the primer, All of those little components make up the cartridge. And as you can imagine, there are endless combinations of these components that you can create. So you could take a certain case and then you could put a different caliber cartridge on it, or you could put less powder in the case, or you could change the shape of the case. And that's what gives us all the different cartridges we have today. Now, the bore diameter of a shotgun is actually measured differently than the bore diameter of a rifle or a handgun. The bore diameter of a shotgun uses a measurement called gauge. So you'll hear the shotgun gauge, like a 12 gauge or a 20 gauge. The gauge is kind of an archaic measurement, and the gauge is determined by the number of lead balls of the same diameter that it would take to make a pound. So let me explain. If you have a 12 gauge shotgun, you could make a lead ball that is the same diameter as the bore of the shotgun. And if you took 12 of those identical balls, they would add up to the weight of a pound. So it's kind of confusing, but also it's the same thing with a 20 gauge shotgun. So if you take 20 lead balls that have the diameter of the bore of a 20 gauge shotgun, they will add up to 1 pound of weight. So that's how the gauge of a shotgun is determined. It's not super important to know the lead balls thing, of course, but you should know that the larger the number, the smaller the gauge. So a 12 gauge shotgun is going to have a wider bore diameter than a 20 gauge shotgun. Instead of cartridges, shotguns use shells. And shells are made up of usually a plastic casing with a brass cap on the end. And then there is a primer. There is powder in the shell. There's usually a wad that separates the charge and the projectiles. And then loaded into the shot shell, there is often bird shot, which are lots of small little BBs, or a slug, which is one big heavy projectile, or really anything that you can put in a shot shell. Usually, though, for hunting purposes, it's going to be bird shot. Now, both a cartridge and a shell, sometimes called a shot shell, both a cartridge and a shell can be called a load. It's like, what load are you putting in your gun? And you might say, oh, I'm using a 270 with 130 grain bullets, and that's your load. Or I'm using a 12 gauge shotgun. It's 2 3/4 inches long, and it's loaded with size 4 shot. Okay, that's your load. I think that one's pretty intuitive. Another term you might hear related to load is handload. And this just means that the person has loaded the shell or the cartridge themselves. So they took the time to gather all the different components, they used some special equipment, and they assembled the shell or cartridge on their own, instead of buying it from a factory or pre-manufactured by someone else. Handloads are interesting because you have the capability to change all those variables. And so you could try putting more powder in your cartridge, or you could try using a lighter bullet. And there's people out there who manipulate all these different parameters to get the most accurate cartridge they can, or the fastest cartridge they can, the fastest bullet they can possibly shoot safely. So hand loading is a whole thing. You might hear someone talk about it at the range. Likely, if you're a new shooter, you're not going to be involved with hand loading for a while. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about sighting in. Sighting in is when you manipulate your rifle or any sort of gun that you have and your sight so that your point of aim matches your point of impact. You'll sometimes hear this process called zeroing in a rifle. And usually, when you're doing this with a rifle and a scope, you will shoot a bullet, see where it lands, and then adjust your scope so that your point of aim matches up with the point of impact. And there's sort of a process you go through to do this, but that's the overall goal. Often when you're sighting in, you're going to sight in at a bench. And this is kind of like how the term workbench is used. It's not something that you go sit on. Rather, it's a table that gives you a solid surface to set up and shoot from. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about bench rest shooting. And that means they're sitting down and they have their rifle rested on some sort of shooting bench. Using a bench to sight in your rifle is very helpful because having that stable platform to shoot from removes a lot of the human error. And you can figure out exactly, you can fine tune the relationship between where the rifle is shooting and where the scope is aiming. I think the majority of people hunting with a rifle are going to use a scope. So on a scope, you have turrets. And the turrets are the little pieces of the scope that spin. And they don't just spin, they actually adjust the point of aim inside of the scope. So inside of the scope, you'll likely have a crosshair. It's like two lines that intersect at 90 degrees. And where they intersect is where you want the bullet to go. And once you've tuned your rifle and your scope to be in sync and your point of aim to match your point of impact, you can then just aim that intersection of the crosshair at whatever you want, pull the trigger, and assuming you have good mechanics, you'll hit your target, right? So the turrets on your scope are going to help you adjust your point of aim. And usually the turret on top of the scope is going to adjust your elevation, whether your point of aim is higher or lower. And the turret on the side of the scope is going to adjust your left to right movement. Now, once you shoot enough, you'll start hearing the words drop and wind drift. And these are pretty self-explanatory, but your drop is the downward trajectory of your bullet due to gravity, and wind drift is the side-to-side trajectory of your bullet due to wind. So if you are shooting at a very distant target, you know that your bullet is going to have, quote unquote, a lot of drop, because as it travels, as it spends time with gravity acting upon it, it's going to move closer to the earth. So it's just like when you're trying to throw a football to a friend. And if the friend's further away, you have to throw the ball higher to account for the drop. With shooting a rifle, you just have to tilt it higher to account for that drop. Wind drift is a little bit trickier because you have to understand how fast the wind is blowing and be able to identify the conditions. But wind drift will also affect your bullet, just like if you threw a football on a windy day or threw a frisbee on a windy day and it got caught in the wind and knocked off course. When you start to dig into wind drift and drop, you'll hear the term BC. And BC stands for ballistic coefficient. And the ballistic coefficient is a numerical value that represents a bullet's ability to overcome air resistance in flight. So in simpler words, if a bullet has a higher BC, it will be more aerodynamic, and drag from the air is going to affect the bullet less. So for example, if you're looking at two different bullets, we can take a 30 caliber 180 grain core locked bullet, and that has a ballistic coefficient of 0.248. Whereas a 6.5 Creedmoor bullet, a 6.5 millimeter bullet, that is 140 grains and is also the same type of core-locked bullet has a ballistic coefficient of 0.410. That higher ballistic coefficient of 0.410 is telling us that this bullet is much more aerodynamic and that it will be less affected by air resistance. So for a practical example, I'm making these numbers up, but say you have a 30 caliber bullet that is 180 grains, but it has a BC of 0.250. And then you have a 30 caliber bullet that is 180 grains, but it has a BC of 0.350. The bullet that is the same weight but has a higher BC is going to drift less in the wind. And it's also going to retain more energy even as it continues downrange. So the bullet with the lower BC is going to lose energy faster than the bullet with the higher BC. And the bullet with the lower BC is going to be more affected and pushed off course by the wind. So really interesting stuff. You can get into the weeds with it, but I just think it's helpful to understand the higher the BC, the more aerodynamic the bullet. All right, next let's talk about MOA. MOA is an angle measurement, and it's used to adjust your point of aim and help you align your point of aim and point of impact. So I'll explain a little bit more, but first, MOA is an angle measurement that equals 1/60th of a degree. So think about geometry. You have a protractor, you have a circle, and a circle can be divided into 360 degrees. If you then divided 1 degree 60 times, so you have 60 equal angles in that degree, you would then have 1 MOA. 1 MOA is 1/60th of 1 degree. To help you understand how we use MOA, think about if you were driving somewhere and I told you to turn 90 degrees to the right. You would know exactly what to do. It's the same thing with MOA, just on a much, much smaller scale. I could say, point your rifle 2 MOA to the right, and it would just be a tiny little adjustment. Now, usually when we're hunting, we don't say, hey, point your rifle 10 MOA to the left or something like that. Instead, it will be a way to adjust your scope. Your scope on the turrets will have a measurement, and it will say something like every click equals 1/4 MOA. So when you turn your turret 1 click, that is going to move your point of aim 1/4 MOA in relation to your target. Or if you move your turret 4 clicks, since it's 1/4 MOA, 4 clicks will equal your point of aim changing 1 MOA in relation to your target. Now, this is all a little bit confusing, and it's hard to think in terms of angle if you're not used to it. But thankfully, MOA relates to something that we're very familiar with. So at 100 yards, the spread of 1 minute of angle equals about an inch. It's not perfectly an inch, but it's about an inch. And at 200 yards, the spread of 1 MOA equals about 2 inches. So how can we practically apply this? Well, what this means is that if you are sighting in your rifle at 100 yards and you need to move your point of aim 1 inch to the left, you can turn your turret 1 MOA to the left, and your point of aim will move about 1 inch to the left. Okay? It's doubled at 200 yards. So if you need to make a 2-inch adjustment at 200 yards, it's still just 1 MOA. And it's tripled at 300 yards. So 1 MOA, the spread of 1 MOA at 100 yards is about 1 inch. The spread of 1 MOA at 200 yards is about 2 inches, like we said. At 300 yards, the spread of 1 MOA is about 3 inches. Now, 2 MOA at 100 yards is about 2 inches. 2 at 200 is about 4 inches. 2 at 300 is about 6 inches. 2 at 400 is about 8 inches, and so on. So it will take a while to get used to this, but eventually it will come intuitively, and having it relate to almost an inch is very helpful. Now, some people will say, don't think of MOA in terms of inches because it's an angular measurement, it's not a linear measurement, and it's not actually one perfect inch. I think for most hunters, though, thinking about it in terms of inches, as long as you're not shooting super long ranges, is going to do you just fine. All right, so that one's always a little bit tricky to explain and understand. Let's talk about something a little bit easier, and that is group. So when you go to a rifle range, you are going to shoot a couple of bullets, and you'll see where they land. And when you shoot a number of bullets and then compare their points of impact to each other, that is determining your group. So groups are helpful because they can show you how consistent your rifle is or how consistent your shooting is. And they can also show you where your point of impact, the average point of impact, is in relation to your point of aim. So where is your scope pointing? And then is that where your bullets are actually landing? So it's best to have a smaller group size. So say you shoot 5 bullets in a group and they all land within 4 inches of each other. That's a lot better than all of them landing within 8 inches of each other because it shows a better consistency in your shooting. And then if you shoot a group and you notice that all of the bullets landed, say, 4 inches to the left of your point of aim, let's say you're shooting at a bullseye on a target and all of your bullets land 4 inches to the left. Well, now you know that you need to adjust your scope. You need to adjust your point of aim so that it matches the point of impact, right? And so shooting a group can be helpful for that because you are going to have some deviation among where your bullets impact. And depending on the quality of your rifle and all the components, and then also your skill as a shooter, that deviation is going to be larger or smaller. But once you shoot a couple bullets, whether it's a group of 3, a group of 5, a group of 20, you can start finding the average area where your bullets are landing and then adjust your point of aim to match that average point of impact. Now, when you're evaluating a shotgun, usually you're looking for something different. If you're shooting shot, you're going to look at the pattern. So the pattern is the arrangement of the BBs that are ejected from your shotgun when you fire the gun. Okay? So a tight pattern would mean that all the BBs come out of the gun and stay very close together. A loose pattern would mean that they all fly far apart. And you can determine your pattern by shooting a surface that will show you the impacts of the shotgun BBs. So sometimes you can shoot at a big painted steel plate or a big painted piece of plywood, or you could shoot at a piece of paper. And once your BBs go through that, you can see what your pattern is like. So when you are trying to evaluate a shotgun and a load, you might shoot and look at your pattern. And then if you're trying to adjust any sort of sight with your shotgun, you might see where your entire pattern groups and then adjust your shotgun sight. Now, if you're using your shotgun without a sight, like many people do, and you notice that your pattern is grouping too low, say it's landing a foot lower than you expect just by sighting down the rail of the shotgun or using the bead of the shotgun, then you just have to account for that when you're using it hunting. So if I noticed that my shotgun was patterning a foot low and that I shot a couple shots and they all went a foot low, then when I was hunting, I would just make sure to aim a little bit higher than I usually would when I'm hunting with a shotgun that shoots dead on. All right, we've got time for a few more here. So let's talk about long range. You'll hear the term long range thrown around a lot. So long range is referring to shooting at extended distances. Pretty obvious, right? But what is long range? At what point does the distance become long range? Well, that's something of an open question. But for me, I usually think of it as past 400 yards. There's sort of an accepted idea in hunting tradition that the average hunter can shoot effectively out to 300 yards or so and kill animals ethically. And this may or may not be true depending on your skill. Quite honestly, some people have no business shooting past 100 yards, just depending on their skill shooting and their rifle setup. Other people are going to be very practiced and they're going to have very reliable, consistent equipment, and they can shoot out much further. And maybe 400 yards is no problem for them. But with that sort of traditional limit of around 300 yards for a quote unquote average hunter, I usually think of 400 yards and out as being long range. And it's also true that the further the projectile gets away from the rifle, the more variables it is going to experience and the greater the magnitude, right? So if you're shooting within 200 yards and there's some wind, maybe it's not going to affect your point of impact that much. But if you're shooting past 400 yards and there's that same wind, now that effect is doubled or even more than doubled out at 400 yards. And so all these different variables come into play and are much more noticeable once you get past traditional hunting ranges. Long-range shooting is fascinating, but it presents some challenges for hunters because even if you are able to pull off the shot at 500 yards, 600 yards, you still have to recover that animal. I can think of places I've hunted in Idaho where if I shot the animal at 600 yards, I would then have to drop 800 feet in elevation and then climb another 1,000 feet in elevation just to get to that animal. And that could take a very long time. In that time, you'll likely lose sight of the animal. So you have to go find the place that you were shooting at from a different perspective, which can be really tricky. And so you've got to think about all that before you take a shot at long range. You need to make sure that you can keep track of where the animal is, either through optics or by marking the area really well. You need to make sure that you can actually get over to the place where the animal falls. And then you need to know that you can get out. And those all require having some sort of plan, preferably before you even take the shot. Well, I hope this episode has been helpful for you. Hunting and shooting can incorporate a lot of jargon, and if you're not familiar with it, it can be a little off-putting. So hopefully this has cleared some things up and will help you feel more confident as you start practicing for the fall. We are getting closer and closer to hunting season, so I'm excited for the upcoming episodes. We're going to do a deep dive on how to hunt. And this might seem simple, but I know a lot of guys who would like to get into hunting and need a place to start. So we're going to go back to the basics and talk about things like how to choose a rifle, finding places to hunt, buying licenses and tags, what happens after the shot, all that, so we can get more people out in the field this fall. And if you're already more experienced, I think this will still be a good series to listen to as a refresher or to share with all your friends who want to get into hunting. Sometimes it feels like there's so much to tell someone, but hopefully these episodes will be a great resource to pass along to get someone up to speed. Now, if you have any feedback or ideas, by all means, send them my way. You can reach me at persistenceoutdoors2022@gmail.com or via the Persistence Outdoors Instagram or Facebook pages. And yeah, we just have a lot of good episodes coming up, and we're going to get into the meat and potatoes here real soon. With that, I will wrap this one up. I hope you guys have a great week, and I will catch you on the next one.